Hey friends, it's Dr. Amy, and I thought I'd do something a little bit different today on this podcast. This podcast is The Most Important Medicine, and we're here to talk about how stories and story sharing really help transform medicine. And I got to be honest with you, we are 9 episodes in, hundreds of downloads. I'm loving this so much. But if I'm honest, I got to give my team a little bit of a break to catch up on all of this incredible information and content that's going out into the world. So I thought, what better way than to just pause and do a little bit of a podcast recap of some of the gems that are coming out from these incredible guests that are coming onto this podcast, whom I'm so grateful to all of them for sharing their story and their human beingness and the passion and curiosity that they're bringing into this space. You know, when I started this podcast, my hope was to create a free space where we could talk about trauma in a way that didn't feel so scary. I do tons of trainings with healthcare organizations, with physicians, with other healthcare providers around what trauma is, what do we do when we see it, how do we know what it looks like, and then once we've identified it, now what? And that's really the space that I love being in. I think the way that we learn about trauma and how to be more trauma informed is by listening to each other's stories. And so this last 2 months has really been an exercise in storytelling and in listening to other physicians, to me, share their experience with what trauma is, how it presents, mental illness, resilience, and all of the intersections. And so I thought today I would just pull out some learnings and some takeaways so that if you're like me and you're busy in your practice or in your clinics, that maybe you just have a few minutes to listen and say, oh my gosh, I just want to pull out the gems. I thought I'd lay them down here for you. So here are some of my learnings so far. First of all, we're not prepared. For me, in my graduate program for healthcare providers and your programs for physicians and medical school, to deal with all of the trauma that we are going to see, not just the trauma that we will be exposed to vicariously, experience ourselves, but all of the trauma we'll see in the patients that we treat, in the healthcare organizations, and in our own lives, really. So that's number one. And the other one is that we're not encouraged to process feelings about what we've experienced throughout the day for our patients, for our colleagues, for systemic hurts that we're experiencing. And we have to begin to find a way to process all of this, to begin to talk about it. And that's really my hope with this podcast, is that there's less aloneness, there's less stigma. We begin talking about what trauma is, what it looks like, what some of these adversities are. You can probably hear my passion. My hope really is to create less aloneness in this world, that somebody might hear this podcast or someone's story and say, oh my gosh, I heard Dr. Corrigan speak about physician burnout, and now I know I'm not the only one. Or I heard Dr. Ginsberg talk about relating to teenagers who've gone through really traumatic incidents. And I know I can do that now too. I have a little bit more feelings of competency around that. Which brings me to my first guest. My goodness, if you haven't listened to episode 3 yet with Dr. Ken Ginsberg, please go back and listen to it. He is just a rock star of compassion and brilliance. And a couple of key things that I took from him were the need to constantly model and talk about how much people need to experience unconditional love. The other thing I really loved about what he said was that people with histories of trauma are often the most compassionate folks to talk to. And that if we listen to them and if we listen to their story, we really will learn so much about how to be trauma informed. They'll show us just by keeping an open door. One of the things that really struck me about what he said was, have we earned the right to hear their story? Have we sat with them, been empathic, shown enough compassion that we've earned the right to hear their story, for them to share it with us? So just incredible insights from Dr. Ginsberg. the other thing I loved about what he said that I took with me as a parent too, and put into my newsletter, was this idea of not talking to our kids about the outcome of things, like how did you do on this test, or did you receive the award, but really just asking them about, tell me about your life, tell me about why this was interesting to you. That way that they know later when they circle back to you that you can bring them anything, that they can bring you anything, that it doesn't have to be that they're sharing this with you because they did well or they got it right, but that they're doing it because you've shown them that you care and that you want them to share anything in their life with you. And that is true for a parent and certainly true as medical providers. And then, I got to talk with Guy McPherson, and he is just amazing, previous therapist, and does a lot of work in his own podcast, the Trauma Therapist podcast. But the thing that rang true for me the most is that we all need to bring our whole self, our human beingness into the work that we do. And so really not being afraid when we're talking to people to respond with humanity, to say like, oh man, geez, that sounds really hard, or that sounds really rough, instead of feeling like we have to be stoic all of the time, or kind of this consummate professional. And that has come out in many episodes since then with other medical providers. But anyway, the Guy's podcast was really fun to record. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to his podcast, The Trauma Therapist, please do so. Dr. Weiser, when I talked to him, he specializes in rural medicine. And I go back to his quote probably once a week, if not more. And it was something like this: ask a question, pass the Kleenex, and then shut up and listen. And I got to tell you, as a psychologist, that comes naturally to me as a therapist, but I know it's not something that's necessarily taught well in medical programs, to really just be a compassionate listener. And over and over again, from Dr. Ginsburg to Dr. Weiser to other guests I've had so far, that is a constant theme. Please know that. Just listening is trauma informed. Just asking a question and then getting out of the way is so important for patients to be able to share their stories. In fact, there's tons of research that shows that people feel partly healed just by being asked about their history, about their experience. So never underestimate the art of listening. Let's see. I talked with Dr. Dominic Corrigan. He is the founder of Physicians Anonymous, which if you haven't had a chance to check out, please do so. And he shared his very beautiful, vulnerable story about physician suicide and physician burnout, and really underscored how physicians are taught to mask and kind of put forward this super competency, and not be whole human beings. The risk of that is burnout. The greater risk even than that is losing physicians to suicide. And so he shares his very vulnerable story about how physicians have been taught to be boundaryless, give everything to medicine, everything to their patients, to their clinics and hospitals, and really lose themselves. So please take a listen to that podcast. It's really beautiful and transparent, and man, he's a funny guy. So that's another thing I took from him. And then when I talked to Doctors Chang and Pedersen, they're both in the world of child psychiatry and pediatrics. And one thing that really hit for me was them saying that the trauma that's there in the exam room is already present. It's just that you haven't asked about it. It's not news to the patient or to the family. And in fact, what Dr. Pedersen says is that it's almost unethical not to ask. And so she really talks about her journey in screening for adverse childhood experiences. And Dr. Chang talks about his experience in working for decades now with our most vulnerable populations in psychiatry. So take a listen to that and really lean into asking about trauma histories and relational histories in families. And then finally in episode 9, which was out last week, if you're listening in sequence, I talked to my really good friend Alfonso Ramirez about health equity. The thing that stuck with me the most about what he said is, if I'm not well, you're not well. And if you're not well, I'm not well. That is really the crux of health equity. Recognizing that in order for our society to be well, we must all be well. We must all be having healthcare that is equitable for everyone, regardless of their race, their background, their diagnoses, et cetera. And so he just had these beautiful examples of times that goes well and times that doesn't go well. So really, I got to tell you, everyone, I'm having so much fun with this podcast. I hope you heard even just a few gems in this recap that you can take, maybe some websites that you'll go to, whether it's Dominic's website for Physicians Anonymous, or Guy's website for the Trauma Therapist Project. There's just so much great information that's getting out there and being shared. And that's really my goal, was to disseminate information about how medicine can be trauma informed. Man, we have some incredible guests coming up in the next few weeks. Diana Londoño is this bright spirit of magic. She's a urologist and surgeon who shares her story of overwhelm and burnout and creating boundaries and really focusing on the positive parts of medicine. You'll hear from Bahia Overton, who is the executive director for the Black Parents Initiative. And man, does she's going to blow you away when you listen to her. She has so many insights into how to treat people of color. She gives us these beautiful scripts for advocacy. And then after that, you'll hear from Dr. Bruce Perry. Many of you know him. He doesn't need a lot of introduction, but certainly a renowned expert on trauma in our world. So I'm really honored to get to talk with him. A couple of other cool things. All of my podcasts are also on YouTube. So if you're a person who likes to see things versus just hearing things, they're all there for you. I try to tape them on, or record them rather, on Zoom so that you can watch them as well as listen to them. So please disseminate this podcast to friends. I just think this is so important to get the word out about what trauma-informed medicine can look like, and so that folks can just feel less alone in the work that we do. And then I always am trying to do free workshops whenever possible for providers. So I have one coming up that I'll link to. If you're listening to this podcast, we're kind of mid-September, but the upcoming workshop will be October 19th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And it's called We're Really Not Okay Right Now. And so I'll do a separate little blurb on that for all of you, and I'll link up to it in the show notes so that you can all join me. It's going to be a wonderful evening with actionable tools that you can take away to prevent overwhelm, which ultimately my hope is that it prevents burnout for so many of you. But that's it, friends. I really just wanted to provide a little recap for those of you that don't have 30 or 45 minutes at a time to listen. Thank you so much for listening. This has been such an act of humility for me, and service and heart-centered work. If I could just do this every day, I would. I'm learning so much, and being in this space has made me just so appreciative for the work that we all do together. So keep listening to each other's stories. Keep listening to patient stories. They are incredible and valuable, and keep sharing your story of humanity, because it's really your stories that will also begin to help heal one another. Thank you so much. Have a great day, friends.